All right, welcome to another show. It has been a long time since I've been on here, and I'm trying to make sure my settings are working correctly. It looks like this is fine. Yeah, it does. All right. So please let me know in the side chat if you can't hear me well. So what we're going to be discussing a few weeks ago, an interesting exchange occurred that caught my attention, and that was Nathan Orman from Digital Gnosis. That's his channel. I guess the reason this happened, he's in this video up above here. He had a discussion. This was on June 18th, and it was with Andrew Wilson, noted scumbag and toilet bug from the Crucible. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I use that language either. He is something of a toilet bug. Um, at least, I mean, he looks like ashtrays smell. When these guys, I guess, had been having an exchange on social media somewhere, and as they were having this discussion, Nathan called Andrew, a fascist, or said that he was performing fascism or liked fascism, something to that effect, right? Naturally, in today's environment, for some strange reason, Andrew Wilson decided to have a cow about this, which is kind of a common technique that a lot of guys on the far right do. And Andrew Wilson is on the far right. He's a fascist. They freak out about this and demand a very exacting definition of this. And then that's kind of where, so they basically had it out here for what, 2 hours and 13 minutes and some change. And I don't know that it really got anywhere. But following that, Nathan did a really good 3 hour video, roughly 3 hour video, kind of describe going into fascism, something that he didn't entirely want to do, but he did anyway. Um, and he did a really good job. It's a good video. Um, Somebody's saying that I sound kind of quiet. It does seem kind of quiet. I don't know why. I think this thing's getting kind of touchy in its old age. And now it's just completely blocking my view. Oh, all right. I'm going to set it there. So, yeah. So, anyway, the the point of all this seemed to be like, well, and Nathan felt that he kind of had to explain his position on this because this so frequently happens when somebody gets into any kind of conversation with somebody on the far right. If you're like, well, that's fascistic, or you sound like a fascist, they will clutch their pearls about, how dare you? You better back that up with a rock solid diagnosis and definition that really sends it home. The reason I think they do this is because there really isn't a great definition for fascism that really works in that pithy a way. It's not like saying you're diabetic, right? Or you're a Mormon. It's much different than that. You can be fascist leaning and not actually be part of any kind of actual official fascist group, movement, whatever. But you can be kind of leaning towards these kinds of tendencies. And that's what we're going to get into. Before I finish explaining stuff and start, going off on long-winded explanations and tangents and stuff, I want to just shout out. I have kind of synthesized with this project a bunch of resources that I've been reading, and links to those books are available in the description of this video. Above that is a link to a friend of mine, a fellow YouTuber, Christopher Mowdy, who's doing really good work on this in his sphere of things. It's not directly on fascism, but it is on the sort of race realism, pseudoscience of IQ and race differences, that kind of stuff. So that's been pretty helpful. His videos are based on the work of a fellow academic that he knew, and all of those videos and shorts are available over on his channel. So his link is there, Christopher Mowdy. If you're interested in taking a look at that, a lot of that pseudoscience and a lot of those backers of that kind of pseudoscience, which goes back generations now in the United States, is very much ideologically, intellectually, if that's fair to even say, aligned with a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about in here. So I put that on there as well. Also, There's the links to the books are in there, and also the links to the videos that I'm going to be sharing here. So we're going to get into some of this right now. This is a huge topic, and I'm going to try to shrink this down to something I think a little bit more manageable for a video I can do. I'm not an academic. I didn't specialize in this. The academic specialization of things like studies in authoritarianism and studies in fascism is a giant rabbit hole. There is a lot of debate, even now, constant debate over what is fair, how is it fair to diagnose or define fascism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason for that is because we have historical examples of groups and individuals who defined themselves as fascist and behaved in certain ways. And we have sort of a cultural inertia that a lot of us hold within us that we use to describe fascists. And if you're in the United States, usually if somebody says fascist, I think most of us in our brains think of like Gestapo or the SS and concentration camps. You think of Nazi Germany at the height of its abuse. That's not necessarily fascism. So, and that's what we're going to get into. I'm going to get into a little bit of a synthesized definition that I want to point out right now is not to be used to throw at people like Andrew Wilson or others who demand a clean cut definition of fascism. Otherwise, they're going to shut the conversation down. The definition that I've got is synthesized from about 6 different main authors, really 4 of the current scholars, the top 4. And that synthesized definition is to serve as a mnemonic, not as a definition. Definitions can be fluid in some cases, especially when they involve words or big things like political ideologies. So it's important to keep that in check. So I'm going to end up providing that at some point. And then we're going to talk about maybe for the sake of these discussions, is it ever safe to call somebody a fascist? Like, when is that? When can you do it? Well, first we're going to get into some descriptions about it, and then we'll go forward. So I'm going to say hello to a few people here. I've already started saying hello to them. Nitty is here, but Andrew Wilson and Doug tell me I need a definition that no one can deny. Right, and that's the problem. Even though I would say probably, it seems like the conversations between most of the people that I are going to be mentioning here, the scholars that I have used as sources for my video, and they were mentioned by Nathan in his video, would agree with each other, but their disagreements are in emphasis or in practice. So one might be looking more at historical expressions of actual self-identified fascist groups, or the expressions of groups identified as fascist by their opponents, either ideological opponents or actual physical opponents, victims. And then there are others that take a look at it as a cultural or a psychological phenomenon, especially a group psychological phenomenon. So, but generally speaking, it's really a difference in emphasis, not so much a difference in like, that's not what fascism is. That discard that, accept this. It's usually like, yeah, that's part of it, but I think more of it is this. And they're like, yeah, I know what you're doing, but I think it's more of that. That's usually what the disagreement is. Good to see a pragmatic crystal. Thank you for the reminders. Let's see. Kent Hovens, CPA, is here. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well down in the Ozarks. Amy is here. Good to see you, Amy. Thanks for stopping by. Spooky is here. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why it's. I can't really turn my. I don't know if it's clipping or not, but lately this mic has been getting quieter, and I'm not sure what's going on with it. I had an emergency spinal surgery last week, so I'm listening high on Dilaudid. Lots of Dilaudid. Well, hopefully this comes through. I hope this doesn't give you nightmares or something. I don't know what kind of effects Dilaudid has, but, and yeah, please get better. That sounds awful. Spinal surgery. Yep, PC is telling me to turn up the volume as well. I've got it cranked as far as I can tell. Let's see what's going on in my actual settings. Nothing there. I'll turn off echo cancellation and see if that does anything. Okay, so if it doesn't, just holler at me. So it looks like what is the definition of I look like a jackass? What is the definition for a jackass? Well, it's a cross between a donkey and a horse, right? I mean, that one's pretty clean. I'm just leaving to Google Dilaudid as I'm on my phone. I find drugs interesting. Dilaudid is a potent one. Aren't they theistic generic IQ apologists? Aren't theist genetic IQ apologists ironically defending Darwinian concepts? In a way, yeah. They're willing to accept social Darwinism. You know, basically the might makes right, strength, you know, strength will win out kind of stuff. But the rest of it, they'd rather not deal with, especially if it, you know, questions like the whole created in God's image thing. Kyle Ferguson says, Andrew Wilson is top 5 bad faith debaters in the online space. Only JP, Jordan Peterson, and Darth Dawkins are probably worse. Yeah, you're probably right. Good to see you, Leonard at Diorio. Spatchcock and a cigar. Nice afternoon. I'll enjoy that. Let's see here. Coco's is here. Good to see him. April Cox. Okay. All right. Okay. So said hello to everybody. All right, let's get this show on the road here. We're going to start with like the basic search that anybody would do. And the link was provided by Pragmatic Crystal, and it's the one from Wikipedia, right? If you go to Wikipedia, or even if Google, or I think like what's Copilot's the one from Bing, will probably pull this definition from the Wikipedia entry. It says fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, and ultranationalist political ideology and movement that rose to prominence in early 20th century Europe. Fascism is characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived interest of the nation or race, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. So that's a pretty good definition of it. But what most of the scholars who actually study this would say, that is kind of incomplete and a little misleading, because what can often happen is that people will take a definition like that and think that you have to, those are check boxes. You have to check all those boxes and then you're a fascist. And the problem with that is that for somebody like Andrew Wilson, seen up above, with the flames of hell behind him, apparently, is that there seems to be this thing, and I'll play this here, where they react to something that I think they leave unspoken, and they should probably, I think they have to leave it unspoken, because if they actually said it out loud, I think they would just end up embarrassing themselves. So let's take a look at that and see what happens. Here we go.
Can you? Well, I don't think it is, but it's a proposition. You're making the claim that I am. Demonstrated. I'm here for you to demonstrate that.
Right. So I'm now I'm asking you what would count as criteria for
Why are you asking me for your position? Tell me what. Tell me how I'm a fascist.
No, I'm not asking you for my position. What I'm asking you for, because we're talking to one another, is what would, you're asking me a question, and I'm asking you what would an answer to that question.
Who gives a shit? Tell me how I'm a fascist.
Presumably you, if you're asking the question.
All right, you made a claim. Can you demonstrate? I'm just waiting for you to demonstrate the claim.
So what a fascist would do is ask a question but not care about an answer, right? Because for a fascist, everything.
You didn't answer. You asked me.
He's actually already starting to answer the question for Andrew. Like, one thing that a fascist would do is ask a question and then not really care about the answer they get, if it doesn't check off the box that they had in their head for where it needed to go. What Wilson is doing is, like I said, what a lot of these guys do. If you tell them that if you say that they're a fascist, what I think they're thinking in their head, you need to tell me how me as a conservative, and in Wilson's case, he believes that he's a conservative and a Christian and a patriot. He wants to know, when he's called a fascist, how he is the equivalent of someone who either worked at, administered, or established a death camp. I really think that's what they feel they need to, that's what it needs to rise to. And if they've never worked at, administered, or established a death camp, they can't fairly be called a fascist. and this is completely wrong. This is just taking an exaggerate, like you're taking an example of a fascist movement or fascist tendencies taken to their craziest extent and saying, well, I have not met that standard of insane evil, therefore I'm not fascist. But you don't actually have to hit that limit. That's trying to say like, well, I'm outside that because I'm not an absurd, I'm not the worst example of it. Okay. That doesn't make Wilson any less than a fascist. So then the question comes up, how do you define what a fascist is? Now, I was in the chats on this, in the live chat when this was going on. And hey, Breakfast Tacos, good to see you. I know, it's been a long time since I've been on here. Also, Fabio's here. Good to see you, Fabio. I know this isn't really early, but I did try to get on here at 5. So yeah, if you did want to catch it live, you could. I remembered. So where a lot of this craziness is going to end up kind of veering off course, and this is sort of the technique. Someone in Wilson's case wants the critic, their critic, to start talking past them right away. And the easiest way to do that is to demand this definition of fascism. Like, I want a fast and hard and accurate and universally 100% agreed upon definition of fascism. And if I don't meet that, you can't call me that. And if that person can't bring that to bear, well, then they'll say, oh, well, then I win. You have no right to call me a fascist. And what they want to do is deflect that broad. I don't want to be called a fascist. I'd rather be called a nationalist or a populist or a proto-conservative or an ur-conservative, masculine Christianity, something in these lines. The last thing they want to be compared to is the Nazi party. But the Nazis are only one example of fascism that kind of got to sort of its worst expression, historically speaking, and rhetorically and politically speaking as well. So Wilson is all very put out by this, and he doesn't have any reason to be. This is just where they're going to be. The problem that these guys usually run into seems to revolve around like basically some kind of questions that you can kind of ask yourself about this. And so what I decided to do was kind of take a look across the 4 scholars that I'd been kind of looking at. And this was Robert L. Paxton, Timothy Snyder, Roger Griffin, and Jason Stanley, right? And what I wanted to do was like, what would happen if you created like a self-assessment questionnaire? What are some of the things, like if you're Andrew Wilson and you get bit by the self-reflection bug and you decide, what should I do? How should I evaluate? Am I a fascist? And according to a lot of their research, based on what they tend to break down, they all kind of crisscross. Like I said, they emphasize very different. They tend to place emphasis on different things, but the overlap was what I was interested in. And so the overlap seems to be, based on these leading scholars of fascism, how do you make the assessment that I'm a fascist or you're a fascist, if you're asking yourself? One is your attitude toward hierarchy and inequality. And I started posting a lot of these questions in the chat at the time. Do you believe that some groups, nations, races, genders, religions, sexes are inherently superior to others and that justifies their domination and control? Right. Second, obsession with national decline and rebirth. This is called, I think Griffin is the one that defines this, palingenesis, right? Do you believe that your nation or your culture is in some kind of irreversible decline and it can only be saved through some kind of violent purification or radical political or cultural rebirth? That's a red flag there. Commitment to a politics of strength and unity. So you ask yourself this question: do I reject compromise, pluralism, or any political disagreement as signs of weakness? Do I idolize strength and strong, decisive leaders who, quote, cut through the democratic processes? That's a good one. The us versus them mentality, which is very much on display in our politics today. So the question is, Do you scapegoat certain groups, immigrants, religious minorities, political opponents, I would also say political or gender minorities, as existential threats to the people or the state or the culture or the tribe or whatever? Do you glorify violence and militarism? So do you view violence, war, political suppression in any way as some kind of cleansing or a regenerative force for society? And that's a telltale one. If you run across individuals who get very, very hyped up about the United States is going to drop some bombs on Iran or someplace like that, and that's just what we need to kick things in gear, that'll help. That'll help the nation's strength. That'll help bolster. That'll put some hair on our young men's chests. That's a red flag. Rejection of truth and intellectualism, another thing that we keep seeing a lot of. Do you dismiss facts, science, and experts when they conflict with your beliefs or your movement's goals? A great one would be things like insisting that immigration is almost all of it seems to be wrapped up in the problem of illegal or undocumented migrants, and that these individuals lead to higher crime, more drugs, more diseases, none of which are factually established, or they're completely unfounded. But many of these guys, in the us versus them thing, they have to demonize the migrant group, also have to reject truth and intellectualism when they're even exploring, like, what is the reason you're rejecting those people? Well, they're migrants. They bring crime, drugs, and disease. No, they don't. Well, yes, they do. They have to. And even if they didn't, we have to get rid of them for the purity of the state or for the culture. They're gonna erode our culture. They're gonna take away our Judeo-Christian values. They're gonna make us more Latin or more Occidental or more or Oriental or more whatever. Occidental would be the West. Another one: anti-liberal and anti-democratic impulses. Do you believe liberal democracy, individual rights, and minority protections are obstacles to the will of the people? A great example of this is something that you see a lot in police shows. This common phrase. I can't remember what book I heard this exchange from, but I really like the character that brought it up. Like, yeah, we arrested him, but he was let go on a technicality. And the other character responded, technicality? I thought you called it your constitution. Cult of traditionalism. Do you idealize traditional gender roles, religious orthodoxy, and rigid social norms and see efforts to change them as existentially dangerous or moderately dangerous? Do you excuse the unethical behavior or dismantling of certain democratic norms because you trust that your leader that represents your impulses and what you feel are your goals and aims is working toward that greater good? So you're willing to excuse the fact that that individual doesn't live up to those standards, but he's working to make those standards something that get applied with great force on everyone around you. And then, of course, and then the 10th question: do you feel that multiculturalism, immigration, and international cooperation weaken or pollute the nation? If it's a yes, you got yourself a red flag. So you could ask these 10 questions to people and figure out where they're coming from. And most of these, like I said, the themes, right? Hierarchy, national decline, strongman politics, us versus them mentality, the glorification of violence, rejection of truth, anti-democracy, traditionalism, leader worship, which is very connected to the whole strongman politics thing, and cultural purity. So let's get into a definition that we can use as a mnemonic to kind of bring this together. Let me see here. I'm going to grab my notes here. The other important thing to think about in this is that another thing that Wilson will bring up, the quick thing that they're looking for to reject. When they're called a fascist, they're going to leap to this hyperbolic image of what if they, what they assume, you assume fascism is, which is the death camp Nazi. And they think that you're being hyperbolic, you're being stereotypical, you're being unfair when you're labeling that. The last thing that they're going to think is that you're applying any of these tendencies that I just laid out, these gravitations towards us versus them attitudes, rigid hierarchies, cultural hierarchies, an us versus them mentality, an addiction to kind of strongman politics. What they and the reason that they'll do that is so that they can turn around and try to say you're just using the word fascist as a pejorative, and that's not true. There are people that do that use the term fascist as a pejorative. And I think Wilson was desperate to get Nathan boxed into a corner so that he could say that's all Nathan was doing. But Nathan had kind of had as an idea of like, these are the kinds of behaviors I would expect to see out of a fascist, and I see them all out of you, Andrew. Although he doesn't really get that far in the discussion that they have because Andrew keeps talking over him. If he can't provide that quick, pithy, I want the definition, and you know what? If one thing doesn't apply to Andrew, if he thinks it's off, he'll reject the entire thing. I know because I've watched him do it before. So, hey, good to see you, Michael Deaton. Is that tea in an actual China cup? Very proper indeed. It is. This is actually, it's not great China, but it is. It's kind of see-through. It's nice. And it is actual tea. I mean, it's decaf. It's late, but anyway. But Jeff, isn't fascism confined to a single set of beliefs and corresponding actions? Of course. Of course. So anyway, those questions kind of get us into this sort of into kind of evaluating like where a person's values are. And this is very important to a lot of these guys because a lot of these guys talk about the kind of cultural values that they're signaling for: Christianity and patriotism and conservative values and capitalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the stuff that they're actually putting out there, especially Wilson, not all of them, Wilson especially, frequently talks about this kind of stuff. Men dominate women in the house. They should dominate them in society. Women shouldn't be allowed to work unless the guy wants them to. They should be barefoot and pregnant because that's the thing that's going to make them happiest. That's natural law. That's God's law. That's how it works. There's no way around it. Rigid social, cultural hierarchy. And he defends it by saying, yeah, I will defend this for my tribe. I'm here to defend this and other like-minded people like me against people like you who think that there's some wiggle room to discuss this stuff. Doesn't like compromise and debate. Also signs of weakness. Wilson checks off a lot of these. The key thing to doing this, though, going forward is not to like say, okay, Andrew Wilson is a fascist. It's obvious to me that Andrew Wilson is a fascist because he would answer yes to most of those 10 questions up there. In fact, I think he would answer yes to all 10 in some way. The issue becomes like, for us looking at this, okay, we've got some questions we can ask to diagnose people. How many of those questions you have to tick off with a positive answer before you actually become a Nazi, before you're a fascist? And the answer is it's not that clear, right? If you're probably one or two, you lean towards one or two, you might be considered like kind of leaning authoritarian or a reactionary, capital R. If you're 3 to 4, you might be proto-fascist, illiberal in that vein. But not necessarily like what somebody might think of as like a full F fascist. But if you start hitting like 5 and up, you're probably at the very, and I would actually probably put it lower than that. I think if you're between 3 and 5, you're probably already entering the realm of at least performing fascist rhetoric. And a lot of times that's the toughest thing to figure out. Does this person really believe this, or are they using this to trigger people? Are they using rhetoric like this to be facetious? And if they're doing that, it's performative fascism, but it's in a way that actually makes room for the actual fascists to get a toehold in and mainstream those ideas further. But somebody in that kind of lower tier who's kind of doing the performative work, I would say, is more classified as a useful idiot. They probably don't even know what they're doing, or they don't think it's particularly a big deal. They're just going to get their yucks out of it, and they genuinely are entertained when the rhetoric from fascist-leaning or full fascist people upsets other groups, and they're there for that to see that shock and awe happen. So that's kind of the thing. There really isn't a purity test on this. It doesn't need to tick every box, but it's about patterns of rhetoric and belief and behavior. And the pattern part is important. It's not just some isolated incident. Somebody does something or said something, especially if they said it off the cuff or it was awkwardly worded or something. Aha, that person's a fascist, diagnosed, going forward. But if you see somebody habitually signaling 5 or more of these kinds of things, they're not flirting with fascism anymore. Like they might be going steady. So that's really important to keep in mind. Fabio said, there is a difference between defining fascism or fascist and no, simply saying that a fascist is someone who adheres to the core tenets of fascism is imprecise. Yeah, because the problem, and Fabio will correct me if I'm wrong here, being that he comes from Italy, I'm sure his take on this is might be a little bit more nuanced depending on what cultural discussions are of fascism in his country. But you're right. The problem with trying to define fascism or saying that somebody is adhering to a fascist ideology makes the mistake of thinking that fascism is in and of itself a unified ideology. And one of the overlaps from these 4 scholars in particular is that fascism is more about identifying how it works, what they're doing, mostly because historical examples of fascism give plenty of examples of the groups saying one thing and doing the exact opposite. I mean, think of the fact that in Germany, it was the National Socialist Party. They legitimately used the word socialist, and this is documented. They chose the word socialist to appeal to unions and pro-labor groups. They legitimately manipulated it. They weren't going to act on the interest of that, of what a lot of those labor unionists stood for, but they used the word socialist to appeal to them. Many of them actually came out of groups like that. And so, that's also another, according to, I think it's in Jason Stanley's book, that's not a bug, it's a feature. The contradictions and the absurdity, that is kind of a feature of a lot of what you see in the behavior of people in these fascist groups, and in the behavior these kinds of things, these 10 questions. If you see people kind of gravitating towards that, you tend to, you can get examples of people that you can probably identify on TikTok videos as being like, that's somebody who could probably answer yes to a lot of those 10 questions. And when you see the commentary that they give, you will see a lot of contradictions. You will watch an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance. And that's a feature of it. Fascist and Nazi is not the same thing. It's not. Nazis are just, Nazis are just a type of fascist group that, gave us the sort of cartoonishly evil definition that we have today, that fascists like Andrew Wilson hide behind. I'm not that bad, therefore I'm not that at all. No, you're a fellow traveler in that area. Okay. Yeah, the far right is really dumb. Yeah, generally speaking. But so is the far left. If you're talking about the far left as far as like an authoritarian left, yeah, that would be dumb. But the United States doesn't have an example of anything far left right now. And we could have that discussion for hours. There is no example of a far left individual. The closest that you can get right now are the editors of the magazine Jacobin and Zoran Mamdani. And Mamdani ain't that far left. So, let's see here. So getting back to Wilson's kind of complaints about this, and this comes up with a lot of guys that are in his, kind of in his circle. The debate. I'm not a fascist. I'm just an Orthodox Christian. This is part of my heritage. No, this is part of my religious belief. The problem with that is that he's actually appealing to a kind of dogma that he may not be able to back up. And the another thing that could be is like, I'm not an authoritarian, I'm just a Christian nationalist. I would say, yeah, you're probably both, especially if you're a Christian nationalist. Those are usually bad faith dodges, because then you end up just sort of, instead of us talking about like, well, what did you mean when you said I was a fascist? Well, now I'm going to describe myself as a Christian nationalist or an Orthodox Christian, and now we can like kind of wallow around in those weeds for a while and never get anywhere. There is a simple example to that. So, like in the case of like Orthodox Christianity, isn't fascism, if you're going to define it in any real way. But you can use almost any form of religion to perform fascist behaviors, fascist leaning things, like out of those 10 questions. Let me get to the synthesized definition here. And again, I do want to point this out. This is from the four scholars here. This is not meant to be, because like Nathan, I agree. The idea of trying to serve up somebody with a pithy definition of fascism is not constructive. But I wanted to see if I could come up with one on my own that I thought kind of captured the broadest strokes in like a short paragraph, to serve as a mnemonic to kind of help people remember what are some of the core things that fascism carries around with it, rather than just sort of jumping to an example of, SS officers or, something like that. So the first one that I kind of drafted was, fascism is a political movement or worldview. You could insert the term ideology that glorifies, although ideology is a little rough because despite what the Wikipedia thinks, most of the scholars don't think that fascism is really a grounded ideology per se. But fascism is a political movement and or worldview that glorifies a mythic national past, rejects pluralism, seeks to restore some hierarchical social orders, and pursues the unity of a chosen people, whatever that means, through authoritarian power, some form of scapegoating, and oftentimes violence. So that's sort of a synthesis of the very, very broad synthesis of what that is. And that, again, this is only to serve as that mnemonic. And so let me see here. I think somebody had jumped in. I think Fabio had something here. Let's see. I'll make an example. Cronyism and an obsession with national birth decline is part of being a fascist, while they're not strictly core parts of fascism. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably a good definition. So it's almost like as if there's two tiers. And this is something that I think Griffin brings up. For Griffin, I think for his definition, the definition of fascism that he's comfortable with, and Nathan gets into this in I think it's the final third of the 3-hour video that he does on fascism. Griffin is uncomfortable describing a lot of the stuff that we see in some of these areas, like Wilson's Crucible channel and these other things, as fascist, because I think for him, it does have to rise to some kind of nationalistic movement, a militaristic movement. If it doesn't hit that level, it's not fascist per se. It's maybe proto-fascist or something like that. I think other scholars like Jason Stanley don't do that, because and I can't remember if it was Stanley or if it's Snyder, had kind of laid out that the vast majority, actually Nathan has it in his video, most fascist movements don't actually get as far as either Mussolini's power, movement in Italy or Adolf Hitler's. So a lot of them end up failing, or they end up getting absorbed into other groups and kind of mutating into something else. So I'll break that down, because the synthesized one, I want to get this out there because I've got the links to the book. So the key contribution from this, so from Jason Stanley, his emphasis seems to be fascism is a strategy of emotional manipulation, fear, us versus them thinking, rejections of truth, and the glorification of hierarchy. And what I've read of his book, that tracks. Robert O. Paxton, whose book I think is probably one of the harder to read. It has a ton of history in it. Fascism is about political behavior. It's a preoccupation with national decline, and he really does emphasize that. Scapegoating the enemies of the nation and rejection of democratic norms. Roger Griffin has a book on it's an academic book, and he edited it. There's a lot of different essays in there from contributors other than him, but his take on it has been fascism is driven by the myth of national rebirth. And I believe he's the one that kind of did this, emphasizes the palingenesis idea, that we have to return to a glorified past. The urgent need to restore greatness through some kind of like holy struggle. And then Tim Snyder's stuff, especially his On Tyranny book, fascism grows by eroding trust in facts, normalizing violence, and cultivating loyalty to leaders who reject legal limits. So, and Snyder's book doesn't even have the word fascism on the title. It's just called On Tyranny. But he does have other works out there. That's pretty much it as far as the definition, other than to say the important point to note is that when people think of fascism, they tend to think of the political movement that came out of the 30s, and they think of the rise of Nazis. But it's not just that historical event, and it's not just that party. It's a political pattern. So it's a pursuit of national rebirth through authoritarian power. And like I said, Griffin, I think, really emphasizes that that has to be there in order for it to technically be fascist. Strict social hierarchies need to be in place. Scapegoating of your enemies needs to be in place. Those people need to be purged. Rejection of democratic pluralism. Remember, compromise is weakness. We can't have that. It tends to thrive on the myth of some kind of glorious past that you can get back if only you do the right things. It can glorify violence, often does, and it usually seeks unity through exclusion and control or domination. So, and that one's key, because if you consider the strengths and weaknesses currently rhetorically in the political sphere in the United States, if the Democrats are kind of aligned with pluralism, they're always saying, oh, we're open to everybody. The Republicans are saying we're open to all those who get in line, who toe the line. That's an exclusive group, right? You have to meet these certain things. You have to toe that line, and then maybe we'll let you in. Very different kind of appeal. Okay, just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything here. I think there's an argument going on in the chat. Josephus says there's a good article by Orwell just called "What is Fascism?" Even in an era when there were very recognizable fascists, it was still a tricky business to try and define the word. Yeah, one of the things that I found was actually a Q&A session, and one of the people involved was an academic who was working on their PhD in this field, in sort of the history of fascism and authoritarian movements. And they said, yeah, it's been dizzying because it's a rabbit hole. You get into one expert's information over here. They have an emphasis that isn't shared by this expert's information over there. So again, this goes back to the case of, well, when Wilson says, well, hey, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say I'm a fascist? The easiest thing I would say is like, okay, well, what are your answers to these questions? Those 10 questions. You know, do you believe in some mythic national past? Do you glorify and cherish authoritarian power? Do you believe in social hierarchies? Do you scapegoat? Do you believe there are certain people here that are making the country worse and need to be removed from it? Do you reject pluralism in the sense that you're not going to allow certain people that don't agree with Christianity, in Wilson's case, to exist in the country? If Wilson established a country based on Christian nationalism, if you were a atheist or a Muslim or Hindu, anything other than a Christian, and anything other than a certain kind of Christian, because eventually they'll start tearing into each other, you're not going to get along real well. Little do they realize that pluralism has helped them quite a bit. Do you glorify violence? Wilson does, I think. Are you an anti-intellectual? Yep. The guy that he's talking to here, Andrew Wilson, is talking to Nathan, who I think is working on his PhD somewhere in the UK. And anytime he has an opportunity to talk to him, he immediately, or if he starts getting a little frustrated or he gets bored, he starts immediately making homophobic insults, lobbing homophobic insults at Nathan. So the important thing, I think, to check off on this list is to make one key distinction, and that is fascism versus traditionalism. Because one of the things that will come up is like, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? Like, is a fascist just a conservative? No. But again, it also depends on what we're talking about when we talk about conservatives. Conservatives can quickly start to tilt that way, but generally they don't. And if they're a traditionalist, at least in the sense of like sort of American traditionalism, that's up for debate. There are plenty of scholars that believe that the country was established essentially as a white supremacist nation. And I tend to kind of be, I'm sympathetic to that view very much. The more you read from kind of what the original ideas of the founding fathers about how they wanted land to work, who gets to vote, who's really represented, all that kind of stuff, it's not good, right? But taking traditionalism into a different light, something broader, not just specifically from the US. Traditionalism doesn't necessarily scapegoat its enemies. Traditionalism wouldn't necessarily glorify violence. It doesn't have anti-democratic impulses per se. Traditionalism will usually enforce some kind of strict hierarchy, an existing hierarchy, either cultural, social, administrative, something like that. Usually the one thing they've got is like the mythic national past. But a lot of traditionalists, at least in the United States, would not fuse religion with the nation. That is kind of radical from a radical Christian right-wing side. Essentially trying to eliminate the pluralism that we have kind of built into the Constitution, but they're trying to do that. Christian nationalism checks more boxes than traditionalism does. In fact, it checks almost all of them in terms of fascism. So it is very much a fascist adjacent philosophy, if not just another stage of fascism. I really do think that it is basically just fascism, but instead of what you can do in the absence of a human leader is glorify the God and create a theocracy, and then from that establish all of the essential things that are coming down here. Even to the point where a lot of these guys, if they kind of have that tendency, you see them in debates with atheists, and somebody says, well, wait, the Old Testament God said this, but did this bad thing. They killed people. They ordered people sacrificed or put to death, or the kids killed, or people taken as slaves. What do you think about that? Might makes right. So if you got a Christian that's willing to do that, red flag. Let's see. Josephus says, homophobia is another very common indicator of a fascist ideologue. That's a real red flag in my experience. Yeah, it is. I mean, they've mostly tried to distill it into transphobia because they lost so much ground in terms of like the public's view of same-sex couples, even approving of same-sex marriage, that they've had to distill all that and direct it at the smallest group, the trans community, and then try to make that their that's the number one scapegoat. That and undocumented immigrants for whatever reason. But that's always been a cyclical thing in this country. People get nativist for some crazy reason. Fabio says, refusing to talk with a fascist is a sign of respect. If I lived in a system like they wanted, I wouldn't be allowed to speak. So by not talking to him, I'm respecting his worldview. Exactly. And to a certain extent, that's kind of true, especially if you get into, there's another video that I plan on doing on this. It's going to be about vice signaling. Vice signaling is a lot more psychologically fraught than I think trying to define fascism, even though fascism is defining it as a huge lift. But vice signaling has its own take on that. And that's kind of why I tagged Pine Creek in this, because my other point in this was this video here. I will share this now. Let's see here. Let's cancel that one. Let's pull up this video. After this discussion happened, Pine Pine Creek made this brief video here. Let's see, this is a couple minutes long. I'm going to play this. I'm going to crank up the speed a little bit. All right, so let's take a listen to this one and see what we've got going on here.
The thing is that this is what I'm trying to point out, right? Whether or not it was appropriate in that case. And I think that actually requires a lot of careful thought. It's going to be thought that isn't, firstly, you're going to need experts who know about crowd control.
Okay. And like cops? Like cops?
Yeah, like cops. That's right. Mm-hmm. You're going to need them to analyze the test video footage, not YouTubers and podcasters who are fishing for content and clips and to push extreme political talking points, right? You'll need these experts to review that footage and say, oh, the police are stood over there. That is this tactic. And here's how this tactic actually has beneficial outcomes. Here's something that, YouTubers and podcasters don't know because it's not their domain of expertise. And I think that that's the relevant way to assess and evaluate this footage to see the appropriateness of whether or not the Marines are required to be sent in a situation like that.
This violence that I've seen is disgusting. It's escalated now since the beginning of this incident. What we saw the first night was bad. What we've seen subsequent to that is getting increasingly worse and more violent. Tonight we had individuals out there shooting commercial-grade fireworks at our officers. That can kill you. And we have adapted our tactics to be able to have a chance to be able to take these people into custody and to be able to hold them accountable. We are overwhelmed as far as the number of people out there engaged in this type of activity and the type of things that they're doing. They'll take backpacks, and the backpack will have a cinder block in it. They have a hammer, and they'll break up the cinder block and use that, pass it around to throw at officers, to throw at cars, and throw at other people. We've seen people with hammers, and you've broadcasted, breaking the bollards behind the federal building and taking the rocks, if you will, or pieces of concrete.
So just to make sure I got this right, are you saying that Donald Trump does not have the authority vested in him via the Constitution of the United States to send in troops the same way Lyndon B. Johnson did against the wishes of the governor of that state? Are you making that claim or not?
I'm saying he legally has that power.
Then what is he doing that's fascist here?
Okay, so that's that was Andrew's question here, and at this point, and Pine Creek seems to be siding with him. Was Trump acting like a fascist sending the Marines to California? The correct answer is yes, and I'll explain why. The video that Pine Creek showed at that segment was the chief of police of LAPD, right? Los Angeles Police Department. I think his name is McDonald, and he gave that press conference there before the National, or right after the National Guard were called up. I don't know if they'd actually arrived in the city yet, or if they were still being mobilized, but it had already been announced by Trump. So it was in the news. The trick that happened during this press conference, and remember, Doug put the thing up there, is trust the experts, right? This is not honest at all. If you look up the press conference with McDonald, and Pine Creek is just repeating stuff that other right-wingers have put out there. They've put out that piece from McDonald to say that justifies everything that Trump did. But in a follow-up question after that statement, McDonald goes into the fact that he was never consulted about getting the National Guard in there. And when they were asked if they could deal with what they were seeing on the ground, he said yes, because one, they can call in more of their own police forces. I think dropped to like 50% capacity on calls, while the other 50% of the force deals with any of the protest groups that are going on, or in any adjacent shenanigans that happen from other groups doing looting, in their wake or whatever, which does happen. And those aren't necessarily protesters. Those are opportunists taking advantage of, some chaos in the streets. And then he said, if that wasn't sufficient, we would request backup from the other 44 law enforcement precincts in the Los Angeles County area, which I believe does include LA County Sheriff. So they had backup, but he wasn't consulted. He answered that question that way to another reporter during that exact same press conference. He wasn't consulted about the National Guard. He said that if he were, he would say that they didn't need them. They hadn't even tapped into their own reserves yet. But Trump had jumped the gun and said, not only do we need to send the National Guard there because it's so out of control and so poorly handled, I'm not even going to call Gavin Newsom. Now, they're, of course, saying, no, Gavin Newsom was called. They called the office and talked to him. According to Newsom's office, they're saying, no, we weren't consulted on this. He went to the press and said he was sending them in, and that was it. He said he called me and said it was super terrible or something like that. It's a mess. In fact, now they're litigating that now because Newsom's suing Fox News, I think. Anyway, but the important point here is that that clip is being used as if the LAPD chief is in total agreement with what the Trump administration did. Not only is it contraindicated that they needed the National Guard there, they certainly didn't need active duty Marines activated, which can only be done, I think, under the Posse Comitatus Act. And even then, well, actually, I think Posse Comitatus prevents that, but I think they have an Insurrection Act that allows them to do that, or another thing that would allow the president to do that if we were being internally invaded. Kind of, I'm thinking kind of a Red Dawn scenario, and this did not rise to that. So, was Trump acting like a fascist, sending the Marines to California? He described the protests as the kinds of lunatics and the insurrectionists and the rebels, and they need to go and they need to stop, and this needs to be purged, or whatever words he used. It was all the same. Strong man, rah, 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 we'll get rid of them. Can't trust these bureaucrats to get it done. I won't negotiate. Compromises for the weak. Big Daddy Trump is here to save all y'all. Blah, 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 blah. He sent them in as a press move. If you send in active duty soldiers when they are not needed to take care of a threat you yourself inflated, you might be a fascist. And Pine Creek is a useful idiot for, kind of excusing this fascistic behavior. Sorry, Doug's outro music is triggering to me. Yeah, I think we're all there now. Fabio says, the title of that video is a red herring. Is sending troops in Cali something that a fascist would do? Yes. Is it enough to define someone as a fascist? Definitely no. Right. Just that one thing? No. But like the thing, and the odd thing is that Pine Creek, he doesn't say in the title, is Trump a fascist for sending the Marines to California? Exactly as Fabio said. That's a fascist thing to do. That's how a fascist would act. And look at there. The way the title is written, was Trump acting like a fascist sending the Marines to California? Yes. In context, yes. The LA's own chief of police said that they did not need the National Guard there, let alone the Marine Corps. And Trump did it anyway, while going onto social media and doing, and making statements about how much worse it really was and how LA was completely overwhelmed by it. And Gavin Newsom was totally incapable of handling it because he just didn't have good enough people in place. Despite the fact that rhetoric makes it sound like McDonnell, the LAPD chief, is incompetent and he's some kind of pumpkin lily or something. He ends up getting like, no. That guy's he's pretty sharp. He's astute as shit. He's saying that these protests are much, much worse. And we're going to use that as evidence of why Trump did the right thing. Really, Trump didn't call McDonnell. He didn't discuss this with anybody. He doesn't need to, right? In Trump's mind. And that's fascistic thinking. Was he acting like a fascist? Yup. Now, is Trump a fascist? Also, yes, but not just because of this one thing. Trump has a pattern of this stuff, of the rhetoric and everything else. Also, but Trump is also kind of a useful idiot in the sense that he's not consistent enough to really fit into somebody's, like, if somebody like Wilson is desiring that, like, well, you have to be consistent in this pattern of behavior. Sometimes that inconsistent behavior, as long as it's veering towards a recognition, a celebration of top-down authoritative impulses, a celebration of violence, decrying of a sort of demoralization of democratic norms, the dismissal of pluralism and compromise, those are unnecessary. Then in that case, yeah, you take those things together, you start getting a fascist. And so I want to wrap this up with this. Just because a conservative clutches their pearls and acts like a weirdo when somebody calls him fascist does not mean that that person, in this case, Nathan, did not in fact hit the target. He hit it on a bullseye. Andrew Wilson is, in all of his rhetorical ways, a fascist. Everything that he presents, the subjugation of women, the eradication of democratic norms, the dismissal of pluralism, celebration of a strong man or strong men, a rigid social hierarchy that is controlled exclusively by his definition of Christianity, not some pluralistic definition of Christianity. We're not talking about Stephen Colbert flavor Catholicism here. We're talking about Andrew Wilson's Christian nationalism. He fits the bill, but he doesn't want to wear the tag. So that's just on him. And for guys like, Pine Creek that have talked to guys like this and have basically defended ideas like Christian nationalism, at least half-assed, but they've done it. I don't think that Pine Creek rises to the level of being a fascist, but he definitely enjoys fascist rhetoric, at the very least, to laugh at the people that fascist rhetoric negatively affects. And he likes joking about it and making light about it. And when people try to make points like, we probably have a real problem in the United States with more of this fascistic rhetoric and these behaviors and what's being encouraged here. And Doug would just be like, oh, lighten up. They're just jokes, or people are just acting out. It doesn't rise to that level because Doug's too cool for that kind of label. But Doug's been kind of like slowly getting pulled into that direction anyway. I mean, he's been saying it for a long time. There are people that actually have made the claim that the kind of people that Doug's like, well, what's wrong with wanting the nuclear family with the house and the white picket fence? Well, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. But if you have a culture in a society or a government that is saying that is the most useful way human beings can interact interpersonally that provides maximum utility for the state. Ben Shapiro has made this argument when he's trying to argue against the government recognizing gay marriage. They're not producing kids, so there's less utility to the state. This kind of thinking is coming from authoritarian thinkers, the kind of people that I thought would be like, "Don't tread on me. We want small government, habeas corpus. You got to, you want to charge me with something. You want to lock me up. You need to bring receipts." Not anymore. Now they can just say, like, your lifestyle does not provide maximum utility to the state, therefore it should be excused. At the very least, not recognized, at the worst, outlawed. And in Pine Creek's case, he does this quite often. In the fact that culturally, he's a cultural scold when it comes to single moms, because he buys into a lot of racist rhetoric about the single black mother. In fact, he actually has a video where he goes off on it, and it's ridiculous. I'll probably do a quick video on that one a little later on. I forgot to cover that one. Let's see here. All right. Coco's, but they'll never outlaw marriage for infertile people. Exactly. As long as those married, yeah. I think the worst nightmare is two fertile people of the same sex being married to each other. Like, what are you doing? You're wasting it. That's the sperm or those eggs belong to the state. Produce kids for the state. We need soldiers and more baby makers. Damn it. So I think that kind of wraps it up in terms of what I wanted. That was the only thing I wanted to do. When I saw that argument, or I saw that debate, I wanted to do a video kind of hashing out definitions of fascism, kind of going over this notion where somebody like Wilson will bring this up. I want this definition and I want it now. And if you can't provide it to me, you're adrift in your feel sorry forism, leftist, LGBTQ defending nonsense, right? All you have to do really is just sort of flip that around. Keep in mind that when these guys talk about leftists, they can't define what a leftist is either. They can't define what a communist is either. And I would argue that defining communism as a political ideology is a lot easier than trying to pin down some kind of concrete, like really definitive notion of what fascism is, other than what I've kind of laid out there, the sort of tendencies built into the psychological and social expression of fascism. If you were to ask these people, and Doug gets it wrong all the time with his, he just thinks that anyone that disagrees with him is a bleeding heart and a soft touch, but he calls them leftists and liberals and hippies. But if you were to ask him to define it, he would just define them as bleeding hearts and soft touches. And that doesn't get you anywhere. And he doesn't care. But they're going to demand that of you. Well, what do you think a fascist is? I think you're just saying fascist because you want to make it sounds bad. Well, what do you think right wingers have been doing with the term leftist and liberal, guys? You just use that. My favorite new expression that a lot of these guys use, and P.F. Young uses it, and I need to watch that video from Nathan because he has a discussion with him. P.F. Young throws the term around all the time, degenerates or degeneracy. If you hear that term being used, it's probably being used by a guy. He's probably online at the time, and he's probably into some problematic political rhetoric and ideology. Mostly because if you throw around the term degenerate and degeneracy, you're usually making a very normative evaluation of somebody's behavior that you can't back up. The degenerate is no different than the feel sorry forism stuff that Doug uses. It's that thing over there that I don't like. There should be a law. That's it. I mean, it's adjacent to get off my lawn or not in my backyard. It's bonkers. So with that being said, this has gone over a little an hour. I think it's time to wrap this up. I did my best on this one. Fabio, I look forward to you sending me an email and ripping me a new one for getting these definitions and explanations of fascist tendencies completely wrong. Maybe I wasn't that far afield, but you know what I mean. If you do feel like it, send me whatever you feel inspired to. Or if I botched it up so bad that you no longer feel inspired to discuss the topic at all, I will understand. So anyway, I think P.F. Young might be going out from the right-wing craziness slowly. When I see him in clips that Pine Creek has done, there are times when I see him kind of reacting like a little eye roll or something like that when Doug says stuff just to be offensive. Yeah. Daniel Cooper says, Trump said that he called Newsom the day before, but the call log the Trump admin showed was from 3 days before the incident. I mean, yeah, that sounds about right. All right, folks. Well, will do. Okay, I'll keep an eye on my Gmail account. I expect here's what you got wrong, American. But anyway, a lot of this too. And the other thing to point out, the 4 scholars that I used are, I think with the exception of one, all-American, and the other one is Canadian. So a lot of this is kind of based on their studies. I mean, no, actually, no. Griffin is from the UK. Some of this stuff, like the way they're trying to apply it to stuff now, is in trying to sort out the kind of radicalized behavior that you're seeing online. And there is a debate amongst academics if the kind of behavior and rhetoric being used by somebody like Andrew Wilson can accurately be accused of being fascist with no real movement behind it. My argument would be that as an individual, probably not. It probably doesn't do much good other than to watch Andrew Wilson squirm because he doesn't want to be identified with something that he is up to his neck in, which I find just personally funny. But because he doesn't seem to understand what fascist rhetoric is based on some of the things that I went through on this video, the broader movement of Christian nationalists, even though it's still kind of small, but it's growing, because that's become a radicalized portion of evangelical Christianity. That group and a lot of the stuff that they're espousing is a deranged combination of most of those fascistic tendencies and trends towards hierarchies and us versus them stuff, all of it built into that. A kind of weird, kind of like a retreat into kind of a tribalistic Old Testament style Christianity combined with conspiracy theories. And I'm not really exaggerating that. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that overlap with evangelical Christianity. It's disturbing how much that is there. I'm not calling dogma conspiracy theories, even though I would very much like to, but that's super dismissive. But that is happening. There is with established conspiracy theories and kind of this the appeal that has towards radical right-wing Christian evangelicals. And so if Wilson does not want to be called, like, I'm not a fascist. Okay. You are a Christian nationalist? Yeah, sure. Damn proud of it. Christian nationalists, that's a fascist movement. So, it becomes one of these things like, well, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, there's a 10% chance it's a goose. And I guess for Andrew Wilson, that's good enough. So with that, I will get out of here. Thank you, everybody, for checking in live. Those of you that did, like, subscribe, email me, let me know what you think is going on. If there is anything that you have out there to recommend to me, my exposure to a lot of social media has been kind of limited, other than some of the stuff I've seen from Nathan. And I've been kind of slow to respond. I've been kind of busy with other stuff and just kind of enjoying the summer, taking a break from social media. But I will be back. Have you mentioned the hilarious candidacy to the Nobel Prize thing? No, I don't want to think about that, Fabio. I just don't, because I can see it happening. I can see it happening in this goofy timeline that we live in, and then just shaking my head like, well, why is anybody why are we letting this guy do this? Like, somebody needs to tell Grandpa it's time for his nap. This is insane. Thank you all, folks. I will be back to do another show probably in another week or two. I am hoping to check in with JL Warren, not this Sunday, but I think it's next Sunday. He's going to be doing one of his Sunday shows. So I'm hoping I can jump in with him for that. So if I don't get another video out, I will catch some of you probably over there. But other than that, that should do it. Have a great rest of your night. Have a good weekend. For Fabio, I know it's way too late at night. So good morning to you. I think it's not morning yet, I don't think. But have a great weekend, everybody. And I am out of here. Take care.